Hey everyone, welcome to the very first episode of True Crime Café. Each week I'm going to be featuring a true crime case that has caught my attention. It might be a situation of a missing person who deserves to be found, or a cold case where there is family still waiting for answers, or it might be a situation where justice just wasn't served. I recently moved to London, Ontario, not the cool London. And I had heard that at one point, London was actually the serial killer capital of the world. I have watched a ton of documentaries, I've read lots of books about true crime, and I had never heard of this. So before I honestly probably even unpacked anything from my move, I started looking into this. As it turns out, a criminologist from Western University here in London had identified through his research that at one point, London had more serial killers per capita than any other city in the world. The first case that I came across honestly floored me because it seems like something straight out of a Criminal Minds episode. This is not exactly a straightforward case. We are going to start in the middle of this case, which brings us back to December of 1974. Diane Bites is a 23-year-old woman living in Guelph, Ontario. She is described as being just very nice and a very well-liked person. She had just recently got a car and moved into a high-rise apartment and seemed to be settling into adulthood. In December of that year, Diane took a 2-week vacation from her job. During this time, she spent most of it with her boyfriend, James, who would actually become her fiance on December 30th. And sadly, this is the day before she was found murdered. On December 31st of 1974, Diane and James got up early, about 5:45 a.m., to have breakfast together before James heads off to work. Soon after breakfast, James leaves the apartment building but doesn't notice that there is a vehicle in the parking lot just sitting there and running. At 6:00 p.m. that night, James returns to the apartment from work, and when he enters the apartment, it doesn't appear that Diane is home. He obviously doesn't see her, perhaps he called out for her. James then goes into the bedroom and he sees a large pile of sheets on the bed. And he pulls back the sheets and it's immediately obvious that Diane has been murdered. Diane's hands were bound with pantyhose and she had a bra wrapped around her neck. Police are called and detectives arrive on the scene along with forensic photographers, and they determine that the cause of death is strangulation. One thing that really put off investigators immediately at the scene was how clean it was for the brutality of what had obviously happened in that apartment. There was no sign of forced entry and there was zero sign of any sort of struggle. At the time, this is something that was really shocking to the Guelph community because, as I mentioned earlier, it's relatively small compared to other cities, and it's just not something that typically happens there even now. In fact, at this time, this was the first murder to be reported in Guelph in half a decade. Neighbors reported to officers that they did see a brown vehicle in the parking lot between 4 a.m. and 8 a.m. just sitting in the parking lot running. Officers also take note that in the same area as the murder, a few blocks away, a report was made to police about a stolen suitcase out of a vehicle. At the time, it didn't really seem like there was any link between those two incidences, but officers did take note. It seems insignificant, but it actually becomes key in solving Diane's murder years later. The only identifying information that officers had in regards to the vehicle that was running in the parking lot was the color, which was brown. And even though officers are combing through vehicle registration records without any way to narrow down the vehicle, there was really no way to identify who this was or why they were there. There's also no vehicles of anyone that is connected to Diane that matched this description. So there was no direct link to Diane and somebody who owned a vehicle that fit this description. So without something like a license plate number or any further identifying information, it was impossible to narrow down the list. Something interesting that I would really like to point out here is if the officers had taken the report of the stolen suitcase, did they also take note of the description of the vehicle that the suitcase was stolen from? Because it makes me wonder if a connection between the vehicle that was identified running in the parking lot and the other vehicle involved in the other incident were connected, which could have possibly prevented what was to come later down the road. And unfortunately, that just did not happen. That connection was not made. Officers took dozens of fingerprints from the scene and they completed over 200 interviews. All of the fingerprints that were collected from the scene were able to be identified and eliminated. This left them with absolutely no physical evidence to be able to lead them back to a possible suspect. At this time, DNA testing was not even on the radar of forensic science, so the officers really had nothing to go on. No other leads turned up in Diane's case until years later. Fast forward to 1977 to London, Ontario, which is about 120 kilometers from Guelph. Luella George was a 23-year-old woman and she worked as a cashier at Victoria Hospital. She lives in a 4th floor apartment on Grand Avenue. Unfortunately, I don't know much else about Luella as a person. On April 15th, 1977, Luella doesn't show up for her job at Victoria Hospital. A concerned coworker decides to head over to her apartment on Grand Avenue to check on her. Unfortunately, the coworker finds Luella dead in her apartment. Inspector Don Andrews of London Police arrives on the scene along with forensic experts and they begin combing the scene for any evidence. In the initial parts of the investigation, they interview neighbors and they also comb the neighborhood. This is when they find in an alley 2 blocks away from Luella's home is a garbage can in an alleyway, and inside of that garbage can is some of Luella's items. Again, at this scene, there's absolutely no sign of forced entry and 0 signs of a struggle. The scene was also left meticulously clean in a way that's very off-putting to officers. Obviously, with the no forced entry, 0 signs of a struggle, and just how meticulously clean the scene was, there are similarities between Luella's murder and Diane, but because the 2 cities are 120 kilometers apart, different jurisdictions, different police departments, there's no connection made between these 2 murders. As investigators are continuing to investigate Luella's murder, they begin getting a series of unusual reports coming in. In May of 1977, London police begin getting reports of women waking up in the night and seeing a man standing in their bedroom watching them sleep. That just gives me absolute chills. Then these incidences that women are reporting in the community begin to escalate. Women start reporting waking up and finding things moved around their apartment, drawers left open, but there is no sign of a break-in or forced entry. Because of Luella's murder, I think the police thought at this time that there was fear in the community, and that was maybe prompting a lot of these reports. Just because these were things that were just so odd and there was no sign of forced entry, and it just really didn't make sense to police. Their thinking changed when these incidences actually escalated into sexual assaults. Women were reporting being assaulted in their apartments, being strangled, and then being left for dead. While police are investigating these assaults, they take note that there is no sign of forced entry, no sign of any break-in, anything like that. This is when the police start thinking that there is a possible connection between these break-ins, these assaults, and the murder of Luella George. One thing that was really puzzling to investigators was they just couldn't figure out how this person was entering these apartments. One possibility came to mind to officers, but it seemed like kind of a stretch. The police considered that perhaps this perpetrator was entering through unlocked apartment balcony doors. Why this seemed improbable to them was that some of these break-ins and assaults were occurring on the 10th, 11th, 12th, 15th floor. So it seemed almost impossible that anyone would be able to get up there and break in through an unlocked balcony door. But they also had to consider it because there was just no other possibility or no other explanation for how this person was getting in and out undetected. If police were considering this as a possibility of how this perpetrator was entering these apartments, they had to assume that this is somebody who is extremely fit, really well built, possibly even a bodybuilder. Take note. And I'm sure at this time, police are just thinking like, this is unfathomable that a human being is even capable of climbing up and scaling buildings up 10, 15 floors sometimes. One of the survivors was able to provide police with enough of a description of the assailant that they were able to create a composite sketch. He describes the man as being tall, strong, well-developed muscles, which obviously corresponded with exactly what police officers had developed in their profile. Unfortunately, this assailant would kill again before police were able to get any sort of lead to direct them towards a perpetrator. Donna V is a beautiful young woman originally from New Brunswick, but she had moved to London less than a year prior for her job. Her brother Bill describes her as being vivacious and bright and happy and a woman with a strong Christian faith. On July 15th, 1977, Donna finishes her job at Union Gas and she heads over to visit a friend at their apartment. She leaves her friend's apartment around 11:30 p.m. to head back to her own apartment. Now, around this same time in the same neighborhood, a man buzzes on a random apartment and claims to be a police officer asking to be let in. The woman who was buzzed contacts London police to verify the man's identity, claiming to be a police officer. And the police inform her that none of their officers are at that address. Obviously, this freaks her out, and the man ends up fleeing. I just want to make a side note here that was a really smart move for her to contact the police and to verify that, in fact, an officer was at that address. Because obviously she found out that none of the officers were at that address, and ultimately it likely saved her life. The next day, on July 16th, Donna does not show up for her shift at Union Gas. I think by about partway through the day, coworkers decided to contact the police to go and check on her. Police head over to Donna's apartment, and this is when they find her strangled in her bed with a cut on her chest. Donna was the first victim to ever have any sort of cut on her body. There was no other victims that received any sort of wound like that. But because, again, of the no sign of forced entry and the cleanliness, meticulous cleanliness of the scene, officers determined that these cases are likely connected. They base this on the similar MO of strangulation, how the scenes are meticulously clean with no forced entry and absolutely no sign of a struggle other than the cut on the chest, I suppose. And it's just meticulously clean. I cannot emphasize that enough. For example, in Donna's particular case, the perpetrator went as far as to clean her cut and actually take the towels to the shared laundry facility in the apartment building and wash them. Also, both bodies were found the same way. They were tucked into their beds, blankets tucked up to their chin, almost as if they were sleeping. Another interesting connection between the murder of Donna and Luella is that the alleyway in which the trash can of Luella's items were found is on a direct path between Luella's building and Donna's building. Investigators are working around the clock to try and figure out who this perpetrator is, because they obviously don't want any more victims, and they can see that things are escalating. On July 15th of 1977, police are going through a list of tenants in Donna's building to see if there's anyone with a criminal history or anything that indicates violence. This is when investigators finally get the first break in the case. Officers recognize one of the names on the list of tenants in Donna's building, and they recognize this name for two reasons. This name is also on a list of previous tenants living in Luella's building. Now, this isn't exactly concrete evidence. It would be a very, very improbable coincidence. This name is Russell Johnson. Now, the second reason that officers recognized Russell Johnson's name is because he was actually already interviewed at one point in the initial investigation. The reason he was interviewed was because officers looked through a list of sexual deviants in the community that could possibly be connected. And of course, Russell Johnson was on this list. I haven't seen any information about the initial interview with Johnson, but for whatever reason, police determined at that time they had no connection. So who is Russell Johnson, and how did he end up on a list of sexual deviants? At this time in 1977, Johnson is 30 years old and living in London, Ontario. He was originally born in St. Thomas, Ontario, which is about 20 minutes or so from London. At some point, I'm not exactly sure when, in his early childhood, Russell and his family moved to Guelph, Ontario. He attended elementary school in Guelph at St. Joseph's Catholic Elementary School. Now, at some point, Russell moves to London, I'm assuming in adulthood, because his father was still living in Guelph, and he begins working for Ford Motor Company. Something to note about Johnson is that he was an amateur bodybuilder. So that immediately already kind of fits this preliminary profile that police have developed of the perpetrator. In May of 1969, Johnson did admit himself to the London Psychiatric Hospital. He expressed that he was feeling very depressed because his marriage was failing, and he also expressed that he was having very sexually aggressive impulses and he was having a very difficult time controlling them. Because of this, he was admitted into inpatient treatment at London Psychiatric Hospital under the care of Dr. Nugent or Nugent. I'm not too sure how to pronounce that, but he was under the care of a psychiatrist there. Johnson received 8 days of inpatient treatment. 8 days. During his 8-day inpatient treatment, he received group psychotherapy sessions along with individual psychotherapy sessions with the psychiatrist. I just really have to emphasize 8 days. That is mind-blowing. 8 days of inpatient treatment for somebody who identified sexually aggressive impulses and clearly identified that they were having difficulty controlling those impulses. I just have such a hard time wrapping my head around this part of this case. I am not a psychiatrist or a psychological expert by any means. Just my personal opinion here. I just don't think 8 days is quality treatment for somebody clearly expressing that they have violent impulses and have difficulties controlling them. 8 days. Following the 8 days of treatment, Johnson stated to his psychiatrist that he was feeling better. And again, I question that, and I feel like the psychiatrist should have questioned that, but what do I know? On June 2nd of 1969, the psychiatrist and Johnson create an agreement that he will return to the hospital if he experiences depression or begins experiencing these sexually aggressive impulses. Following his discharge from London Psychiatric Hospital, Johnson did continue outpatient care with the psychiatrist. I'm not sure how frequently they would meet, how often the psychiatrist would check in or see where he's at with these aggressive impulses. What I can tell you is that the psychiatrist stated during his testimony that at some point or at one of these outpatient visits, Johnson indicated that he was still struggling controlling these sexually aggressive impulses. But yet, Johnson did not receive any further inpatient care. The psychiatrist thought Johnson had them under control. Clearly, that was not the case. Fast forward back to 1977, while police are investigating Donna and Luella's murder, they start really identifying Johnson as a potential suspect. They begin looking into his background and see that he has spent a period of time in his life in Guelph. London police decide to contact Guelph police and see if they have had perhaps any interactions with Johnson or if they know any information about him. And this is where London police learn something very interesting. Remember when I mentioned during the investigation of Diane B's murder in Guelph, there had been a person who reported a stolen suitcase out of a vehicle. This person was Russell Johnson. Boom, connection. This now circumstantially connects him back to another murder. It indicates that Johnson was in the neighborhood on the same day as the murder of Diane. Since he is already suspected of two murders that are very similar in London, Ontario, police start making this connection. Police also note that the vehicle that was described in the parking lot running between 4 a.m. and 8 a.m. in Diane's parking lot actually matches the description of Johnson's vehicle. Boom, connection. So now police are like really starting to put the pieces together. They're really starting to make all these connections, but everything they have is circumstantial. They have no forensic evidence to place him directly at the scene of the murder. They have no eyewitnesses that could directly connect and identify Johnson as being someone who was involved. Inspector Don Andrews, this is a more recent photo of him, decides to put Johnson under 24-hour surveillance because they have nothing that they can really bring him in on that is concrete. Surveillance included 4 cars with 2 officers in each car working 24 hours around the clock, keeping an eye on him. Constable Gary Harding is part of the surveillance team at this time, and he describes that looking at Johnson, you would think he was like anybody else. It's kind of like that Ted Bundy factor. Gary Harding describes looking at Johnson, he is very well built, he is very suave and a very confident looking person. As the surveillance goes on throughout the days, officers pick up on some things that are very interesting to them that they take note of. One thing is that they notice that Johnson is very, very, very clean, like more than what is considered average cleanliness. Officers also observe Johnson doing something that isn't necessarily incriminating, but is definitely very odd behavior. Johnson would get into his car and he would just drive to what seemed to be random locations. He would stop and park his car and get out and just walk to either the street corner or just some kind of random spot, and he would just stand there. After a few minutes, he would return to his car and he would get in and he would sit in his car almost as if he was like waiting for someone. Upwards sometimes of 30 minutes at a time, he would just be sitting in his car. But then he would just leave. It definitely didn't give officers anything that they could move on him for, but it was definitely things that they were taking note of that were just very odd. On July 28th, 1977, officers are still doing surveillance and they learn that Johnson is planning an impromptu trip out of town. Police are possibly thinking at this time maybe Johnson is on to their tail. They don't really know, but they believe they kind of have to make a move. There is no physical evidence or anything that they can directly tie Johnson to these crimes, so they would be relying solely on getting a confession. Officers arrive at Johnson's apartment, they knock on the door, and when he answers the door, he speaks in a calm tone and he asks the officers to enter so that he could clean up. One thing officers take a mental note of when they enter the apartment is how clean it is. Like more than what would be the average level of cleanliness or organization in a home. Which again kind of goes back to fitting the profile that the police had initially developed. Johnson then proceeds to wash his hands before he leaves with police. I mean, if officers arrived at my house questioning me about crimes I may have committed, my first thought is not to go and wash my hands. Johnson is interrogated by London police over the next 22 hours. During this interrogation, he begins breaking down, he just starts acting hysterical, and at some points is crying uncontrollably. And he is doing this as he describes what he has done. Johnson begins explaining that there would be times he is just driving around and all of a sudden would develop an intense urge to do something. He would stop and park his car and get out, and he would begin walking without knowing anywhere of where he was going, which really explains some of the things that officers observed during their surveillance, because he was doing that exact thing during that time and perhaps contemplating, am I going to do something? Am I not going to do something? I'm not too sure what was going on in his head. He admitted that he knew that he was climbing these buildings, but that as he was doing it, he couldn't even believe it. He even describes one time where he returned to the scene the next day and saw police officers and just couldn't believe what he had done. He explained to officers that he would wake up the next day and know that he had done something, and then everything would just start coming back to him as if it were a dream. Johnson stated at one point during the interrogation, "When I killed that girl in my building, I knew I needed more help than I realized." I mean, you think maybe after the first time he would have realized that, but unfortunately that was just not the case. One of the strangest things Johnson said during his interrogation was the reason why he so meticulously cleaned the apartments, in the particular case of Donna, where he had actually cleaned her cut and washed the towels, is that he did that because he didn't want the women to be mad at him. Now, one of the most disturbing things I read about this interrogation was when Johnson was asked why Donna had a cut on her chest. And this is why I said that this is a case that just seems like something right out of Criminal Minds. Johnson stated, and this is not an exact quote verbatim, but he said that the reason he cut Donna was because he wanted to crawl inside of her and feel safe. Who hurt this guy? I was not able to find anything out about this, but I would really love to know what happened in his childhood. When I read that statement, it honestly had me shook and it chilled me to my core, because I don't think I've honestly ever heard something so dark and disturbing in my whole life. And if that isn't disturbing enough, Johnson starts explaining that he has done other terrible things, but that he didn't want to admit to police what they were. At this point, they already have his confession for the murder of Diane, Luella, and Donna. So, senior Crown attorney Michael Martin offers Johnson a deal. They offer Johnson to admit to any other offenses that he has committed, but will only face criminal charges for the 3 first-degree murders. Johnson agrees, and this is when he admits to the murders of 4 other women whose deaths were originally ruled to be death by natural causes. I'm sure at this point, London police are like, wait, what? And this is what brings us to the actual beginning of this case. Mary Hicks was a 21-year-old woman living in London in 1973. Keep in mind, that's only 4 years after Johnson sought inpatient treatment at the London Psychiatric Hospital, his 8-day treatment. Unfortunately, I don't have a lot of information again about who Mary was as a person, and I don't have a photo of her. I think a lot of that is because originally her death was ruled to be natural causes, so there really isn't a lot of information about her. What I do know about Mary Hicks is that she was one of 5 children, and her family was originally from Ottawa. She had moved to London to attend Western University, and I believe she was in her final year. Mary was found dead in her apartment on October 17th of 1973. Just like the other murders and break-ins and assaults, there was no sign of forced entry, there was no sign of a struggle, nothing was disheveled around the apartment, and there was nothing to really indicate that foul play had occurred. She was found tucked into her bed with the blankets pulled up, just as if she had been sleeping. It was believed that she had died because of an allergic reaction to a medication which caused suffocation. Russell next disclosed to police about his murder of Alice Ralston. Alice was living in Guelph, Ontario in 1973, and she was 42 years old at the time of her death. Allison was found dead on November 30th of 1973. Her death was originally thought to be caused by hardening of the arteries. Back in London, about 3 and a bit months later, Eleanor Hartwick was the next to be found dead, and her death was also ruled to be of natural causes. Similar to Mary, her death was believed to be caused by suffocation due to a medication that she was prescribed and reacted to. When I originally was digging into this, I kind of thought to myself, like, who is this pathologist? But what it really came down to is how meticulously clean everything was in the scene. The victims were found in their beds, blankets tucked up to their chins as if they had been sleeping. It didn't even seem like they had been disturbed in their sleep or anything like that. There was no forced entry and no signs of a struggle. So I guess in the minds of the people investigating this was that there had to be some other explanation other than foul play, and it had to be something natural. The final victim of Russell Johnson that he admitted to in this confession was that of Doris Brown. Doris was 49 years old at the time of her death, and she was from Guelph. Doris's niece described her aunt as being very humorous, very warm, and just a lively person. Friends would also describe her as being very dedicated, very graceful, and just a very refined person. On August 9th, Laura goes into her mother's room, and she can see from the doorway that her mother is laying in bed looking peaceful, and her blankets are tucked up to her chin. At this point, Laura calls out to her mom in an attempt to wake her, but doesn't receive a response. There's nothing to indicate that anything of foul play had occurred. Again, everything is clean, nothing is disheveled, there's no sign of a struggle, no forced entry. And so no investigators were actually called to the scene. It was immediately ruled death by natural causes. The doctor actually met with the family and really had no explanation for her cause of death. In fact, the exact words that the doctor had said to Laura was that he suspected some sort of crib death. And as we know, it wasn't until years later when Laura and her family get a phone call from police that they had a person in custody who was a serial killer who had confessed to killing her mother. So not only had Johnson confessed to the murders of 3 women that the police had initially suspected, he has now also confessed to 4 additional murders. Because of the deal brought forward by senior Crown Attorney, he would only be facing 3 first-degree murder charges. Russell would go on to stand trial in January of 1977 for the 3 first-degree murder charges. Johnson's defense team went ahead and made a case for not guilty by reason of mental illness. Johnson was evaluated by psychiatrist for the trial, in which it was verified that he was in fact a sexual deviant who had mental health that had been deteriorating for years. The psychiatrist also determined that Johnson would experience psychotic episodes in which he would completely lose touch with reality. The Crown actually agreed with the defense on this matter, and therefore Johnson was sent to what was at the time known as Oak Ridge Mental Health Facility in Penetanguishene. That is a very long word. It's now known as Waypoint Mental Health Facility, and he is in a maximum security unit there. In the circumstance of being found not criminally responsible due to mental illness, Johnson is entitled to a yearly hearing by the Ontario Review Board. At these hearings, Johnson can request for certain privileges, or he can request for transfer to a more medium secure facility. He can also request to be evaluated for potential release. Previous privileges that Johnson has been granted is he is allowed to take supervised walks around the perimeter of the facility. I believe still on the property of the facility, but I do believe it is outside and they are most definitely supervised. The earliest information I can find about Johnson's hearings is from 2010. At this May 2010 hearing, Johnson requested to be transferred to a medium secure facility in Brockville, Ontario. Now, in the facility that Johnson is at Waypoint, it is a maximum secure facility and it is men only in the unit that he is in. The facility in Brockville that he was requesting to be transferred to has men and women at this facility, and patients are not locked in their rooms at night. Janice Blackburn, who is an attorney for the Oak Ridge facility, she really put it best when she said, and I quote, "There is a sleeping victim pool in the walls of Brockville." In the report released in regards to the 2010 hearing, we learn a little bit more about the treatment Johnson is receiving at the Waypoint facility. We learn at this point in time he is prescribed something called Lupron, which is meant to lower testosterone and completely diminish sex drive. However, despite being on this medication, professionals at this facility do believe he is still a danger. Johnson will remain at the maximum secure facility. The latest information that I could find anywhere was from the July 2019 hearing. The 2019 hearing is actually very interesting. The report released, we actually gain a lot of information into Johnson's mind. In the report released by the Ontario Review Board in 2019, it was determined that overall, Johnson is generally satisfied with himself and doesn't see any further need to make changes. At this time in 2019, Johnson is actually 72 years old, but despite his advancing age, psychiatrists still believe that he is absolutely a danger. It is at this time in 2019 that we learn that Johnson actually is diagnosed as a sexual sadist, which, if you don't know what this is, it is a disorder characterized by fantasies and impulses in which sexual gratification is obtained through psychological or physical violence. That is not anything like something like BDSM. I don't want people making those connections. That is a consensual thing. Sexual sadism is absolutely not a consensual thing. Johnson is also determined to be what's called a voyeur. He also has difficulties with fetishism. He is also determined to be a necrophiliac. He is also diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder as well as various substance abuse disorders. It's in this 2019 report that we learn that Johnson doesn't really take full responsibility for his actions. Johnson is unable to accept that he is a sexual sadist, and he continues to externalize the blame for his atrocities. Johnson blames substance abuse, his failing marriage, and sleep problems that caused him stress at the time of the murders. Johnson's current psychiatrist stated in 2019 that Johnson is someone who is motivated by a need for vengeance and control over women. Although the psychiatrist believes that Johnson does well in his current facility in the sense of he participates, he takes leadership, and he participates in activities such as woodworking and sport and fitness, they also note that he really is not engaged still with his caregivers. They really don't believe that Johnson fully discloses his thoughts or feelings to the professionals that work with him. For those reasons, Johnson's request was denied in 2019 to be moved to a medium secure facility. Although this is a solved case and it goes back decades, I still think this is a really important case to get out there. Some family members have been quite vocal in the media about their concerns that as Johnson ages, maybe people might develop some kind of sympathy for him, or that because of his age, he will no longer be seen as a threat or danger. Every year, there is a potential that he could be transferred to a medium secure facility or possibility of release, although I highly doubt that. Every year, these families travel up to the facility at Waypoint and they attend these hearings to advocate for their loved ones that they lost. And every year, they have had to relive the trauma of losing their loved one in such a horrific way. And of course, a lot of the family members are advancing in age themselves. A lot of the parents of victims can no longer attend because just not able to make the trip that far up north. And so it's been up to the next generation and the generation after that to continue to advocate to ensure that Johnson remains in a maximum security facility. I think it's really important to help the families advocate for themselves and for their loved ones that they lost, but also to advocate for women who are in medium secure facilities who could potentially be at risk. Just because you hear mental illness, please don't think dangerous person. Not all people with mental illness are like that. And so I just want to make that disclaimer because I know that there are people out there who are going to hear this and they're going to latch onto that and they're going to run with it. Thank you so much for tuning in to my very first episode. I will provide any updates on these hearings in later videos if anything comes up that is significant in this case. At least we know that London is the serial killer capital of the world, and well, at least it was at one point, and this is just one of several in regards to that. I hope you can join me next week where I'm going to be talking about the unsolved murder of Jackie English. Make sure you hit the subscribe button and you can join me next week for True Crime Café where justice will be served.